Good morning and welcome to the 2016 Royal Tyrrell Museum Speaker Series. Today, the Royal Tyrrell Museum and its cooperating society are proud to present our very own Dr. Caleb Brown. Caleb is the Betsy Nichols Postdoctoral Fellow here at the Royal Tyrrell Museum. He's originally from northern British Columbia but grew up in Red Deer. He received his bachelor's degree in zoology from the Department of Biological Sciences at the University of Calgary and spent 3 summers during his undergraduate years working in the preparation lab here at the Royal Tyrrell Museum. After completing his BSc, Caleb stayed at the U of C to pursue his master's degree, again in the Department of Biological Sciences, where he investigated the diversity of small plant-eating dinosaurs in the late Cretaceous of Canada. After successfully defending his thesis, Caleb moved out east to pursue a PhD in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at the University of Toronto. For his dissertation, he studied the variation and evolutionary morphology in horned dinosaurs from Dinosaur Provincial Park. Fresh out of his PhD, Caleb moved to Drumheller to take on the postdoctoral fellowship position at the museum. Caleb's research interests focus primarily on the evolution of dinosaurs, particularly Ceratopsians. Over the years, Caleb has conducted field work in Alberta, Saskatchewan, the Northwest Territories, China, and Mongolia. Today, Caleb will talk about the discovery of Regaliceratops, also known as Hellboy, and will discuss this new species of horned dinosaur and how it has changed what we know about the evolution of Ceratopsians. As Francois would say, without further delay, I present Dr. Caleb Brown.
Thank you. Okay, good morning, everyone. Can you all hear me at the back? We're good for audio? Good. Thanks for coming. And as Wendy suggested, what I'm going to be talking to you about today is the museum's latest dinosaur, a new animal called Regaliceratops, also known as Hellboy, that was unveiled last year. So before I get into the details of our new species, our new specimen, I'll give you a bit of a history about horned dinosaurs. The first horned dinosaurs were found as part of the Great Dinosaur Rush that took place in the western U.S. during the latter half of the 1800s. And several specimens were found. Not all of them were recognized for what they were. Some were recognized as belonging to a dinosaur, but it wasn't necessarily obvious that this was a horned dinosaur. And some of the isolated horns were interpreted as something else entirely. Famously, some of the horns from something that would later be identified as Triceratops were thought to be from a giant fossilized bison. So we didn't really know what horned dinosaurs were, what they looked like, until the first specimen was found that had a relatively complete skull. And that was Triceratops, found in 1889. And that really cemented our understanding of what Ceratopsians were, what horned dinosaurs were. It didn't take us long till a few years after till we had multiple complete skulls of Triceratops, and a couple years later we had the full skeleton of the animal. Because it was found so early and because it was very well known from the skeletons, Triceratops actually represents one of our best known dinosaurs, and because of that it's been really firmly entrenched in our popular culture as well. Just for comparison, the image at the top was the skeleton known of Triceratops in 1896. Tyrannosaurus rex wouldn't be described for another 9 years. So we knew about Triceratops very early. And just to compare how our ideas have evolved, the top drawing is, again, 1896. The bottom drawing is from 2013. And although some of the proportions have changed, some of the posture has changed, we haven't really changed our idea of what this animal actually looks like that much. And because it was known so well, Triceratops was featured in some of the, Triceratops and other horned dinosaurs were featured in some of the first interpretations of what dinosaurs looked like. And these were done by Charles Knight, a very famous paleoartist at the turn of the century as well. With the discovery of these horned dinosaurs, they needed to be a group in which they could all be united. So a new family was named, the Ceratopsidae. And this basically translates into the horned-faced family. There were several features that united this group at the time. The first was the rostral bone, so a separate bone at the front of the mouth and the upper jaw. Post-orbital horns, these are basically horns above the eyes. This frill, and the frill is basically this elongation of the skull over the neck. It's made up of two different bones. I'll get into a bit more detail about that later on. And then finally, these things called frill epiossifications. And these are separate bones that are arrayed around the margin of the frill. And they kind of result in this scalloped edge. Sometimes they're little bumps, sometimes they're big hooks or spikes, depending on the species. And horned dinosaurs also have a horn over the nose, or nasal horn, although this wasn't part of the original diagnosis of the family. Now, everyone thinks of Triceratops when you think of horned dinosaurs, but it's just one particular example. There is a huge array of different species that belong to this group. There's currently about 40 species that are generally agreed upon being valid. This is a great illustration by paleoartist Julius Cittoni that illustrates the variation within that group. The important thing to keep in mind here is that the bodies of all these animals are relatively similar, and it's really only the heads that change. And each species is diagnosed by a suite of characters, and generally those are the relative size and proportions and the shape of the horns and of the frill. And this just gives you an idea of the variation within that group. Our knowledge about the behavior of the animals is that these were quadrupedal or four-legged animals. They were herbivorous, plant-eating dinosaurs, and they were a big component of the dinosaur fauna of the time. Because of their prominent horns and frills, a lot of speculation has happened about what is the function of these things. Why did these structures evolve? And of course, because Triceratops was the first one found and it had such a big frill and big horns, and because it lived at the same time as Tyrannosaurus rex, the early ideas were that this was a defensive armor protecting from these tyrannosaurs. It's a very common idea. More recently now, we're thinking that these frills and these horns were more for display. They were for show, whether that was for trying to impress members of the opposite sex, trying to intimidate members of the same sex, or some sort of communication within that species as opposed to fighting with another species. And this is consistent with a lot of these display structures that we see today in modern animals, horns and crests and dewlaps and stuff. They're generally for trying to impress or communicate somehow with members of the same species. I'm not saying that they wouldn't have used its horns in defense if it had to, but that wasn't probably the main driving evolutionary force for the development of those horns and frills. So horned dinosaurs themselves, just like all dinosaurs, were restricted to the Mesozoic era in our geological timescale. I'm just going to throw up a figure here. Don't get scared. This is basically the only reason I'm throwing this up is to show where the major dinosaur groups radiated, or when they radiated. So basically when those different major groups evolved first. And the only take-home message I want you to take from this is that the Ceratopsidae are basically the last major dinosaur group to evolve. Dinosaurs existed for about 160 million years before the extinction. Ceratopsids didn't really show up until the last 20 million years or so. So they were on the Earth for a very short amount of time compared to all the other dinosaurs. Now this has two main implications for where we find dinosaurs today. The first is that there's only a very limited age of rocks in which we can find the remains of ceratopsids as opposed to most dinosaurs. And secondly, because during the entire Mesozoic, the continents were separating. You had Pangaea kind of at the start, and then they were aligning with more of a current continental array later at the end of the Cretaceous. Animals or groups that had evolved earlier had a better chance of having a more global distribution. They had a better chance to expand around the globe. Whereas groups that evolved later on more likely to be restricted to individual continents. And part of this reason is why ceratopsids are so restricted geographically. They're only found, with one exception, in Western North America. And this is kind of odd. Most major dinosaur groups are found on multiple continents. And this is good if you work on ceratopsians and you live in North America, because it means that most of the specimens are right here. In fact, if we zoom in on southern Alberta, you can see we're kind of right in the heartland of horned dinosaur country. We have so many horned dinosaurs here locally. And a lot of the contributions to our understanding of this group have come from here at the Royal Tyrrell Museum. The other thing that I want to highlight is that although we have this diversity currently, this hasn't always been the case. This is the diversity as of about 2014, so it's already a bit out of date. all the taxa that I've left remained colored in are new since 2000. So in the last 15 years, we've really increased the number of dinosaurs, the diversity of this group. And I'm just going to show you how this has happened and why this has happened. This is basically a timeline on horned dinosaur research. So you have the years at the bottom. And what I'm going to plot on the vertical axis is the number of valid species at that particular time. And you're going to see the discovery curve go up. It flattens out kind of between in the 50s to the 80s, picks up again in the 90s until about 2005. And in 2005, it just spikes up. We really have a huge explosion in horned dinosaur research and in horned dinosaur diversity at that point. And in fact, there are more species of horned dinosaur described in the last 10 years than in the preceding 118 years. So it's actually a really exciting time to be working on this group. There's a lot of activity, and there's going to be even more horned dinosaurs in the future. There are several being worked on right now. I also want to highlight that the Royal Tyrrell Museum here in Alberta has been particularly important in this increase in diversity. So first of all, in 2007, just as the spike was increasing, the Tyrrell Museum hosted the Ceratopsian Symposium. And then 3 years later, the accompanying book that resulted from that symposium was published. And this is actually largely responsible for that huge increase in the number of species. So it really shows the impact that our museum can have on our understanding of an entire group. Just to show this in another way, here's a timescale. In this case, the years are going down towards the bottom. And these are just all the different species that were named in those years. 2009 was a bit of an off year, nothing was named, but everything else, there's a different horned dinosaur each year. Don't worry about the names so much. The important thing is that the ones I've highlighted in red are from Alberta. And the ones I've highlighted with an asterisk after them, those specimens belong to the Royal Tyrrell Museum of Paleontology. So we've had a huge effect on the increase in diversity of this particular group. So that's why I'm very excited to be working here and working on these animals. And in fact, if we look at the current diversity of this group, 44% of all known species occur in Alberta compared to the rest of the world. So we almost have half the horned dinosaurs in the world right here in our province. Within the group, Ceratopsidae, there are two main subgroups. The first of these is called the Chasmosaurinae, in blue on the left. And they're made up of animals like Chasmosaurus, Anchiceratops, and Triceratops. And then the other group on the right in red is called the Centrosaurinae. And they're made up of animals like Centrosaurus, Styracosaurus, and Pachyrhinosaurus. All of these are visible in the gallery if you guys are curious. The main differences between these groups are, or some of the main differences between these groups are actually located in the snout and the nasal region. But the really obvious differences are actually the horns and the ornamentation. So just quickly, the Chasmosaurians have generally a small horn over the nose. They have this big horn above each of the eyes. And then the frill is rather long, but with small processes all the way around. In contrast, the Centrosaurians tend to have a big horn over the nose. In some cases, this is a boss, like with Pachyrhinosaurus. They have small horns above the eyes, and their frill is generally short, but it has these big spikes and processes coming off the back, contrasting with the Chasmosaurians. And this is a very simplified diagram showing our understanding of the evolution of these two groups. And what I've done is I've taken individual species and plotted them vertically according to where they occur in time, approximately. So that's basically your vertical time axis. The important thing that I want to point out is that the Chasmosaurians over on the right, they go extinct before the rest of the dinosaurs go extinct. They go extinct in the early Maastrichtian, whereas the Chasmosaurians make it all the way up to the end of the Cretaceous when all the dinosaurs go extinct. The other thing that I've done is I've kind of put these animals on an axis of how extreme they are for each of their morphologies within those subgroups. So the further the animal is to the right, the bigger the nasal horn compared to the postorbital horn. And the further it is to the left, the bigger the postorbital horn is to the nasal horn. It's a bit simplified, but it kind of helps look at some of the evolutionary trends within these groups. And this was the diversity before that big diversity spike starting in about 2005. If we fill in that diversity, we get this picture. And particularly, I want to highlight these basal Centrosaurians that are highlighted with the dash there. These are animals like Albertaceratops, Diabloceratops, and Nusutoceratops. And although they are Centrosaurians, they are characterized by large horns over the eyes, they're characterized by a small nasal horn. What we've also uncovered is more of an understanding of the morphology of the sister taxon to the Ceratopsidae. So this is the animal that's closest related to these animals without actually being a ceratopsid. And it has large horns over the eyes and no horn over the nose. So what that tells us, in a very simplified idea, is that the Centrosaurians, through time, are de-emphasizing the postorbital horn, or the eye horn, and they're emphasizing the nasal horn. The nasal horn is getting bigger, the postorbital horn is getting smaller. And on the other side, the Chasmosaurians are kind of doing the opposite. Initially, earlier in the group's history, there was a large amount of variation in relative horn size within Chasmosaurians, but then as you get further in time into the Maastrichtian, they all kind of have this same morphology of having large horns over the eyes, small horns over the nose. And this is the situation into which our new species appears, okay? Just kind of setting the stage. So I want to briefly talk about the discovery, some of the excavation and the preparation of the specimen. The first thing that's important about this new specimen is where it comes from geographically. So here's a map of southern Alberta. Don't worry about the large areas of colors for the moment. What I want you to concentrate on are the colored circles. Those are the geographic occurrences of Chasmosaurian specimens or species within the province. And the thing I want to highlight is that those are all restricted to the southeastern part of the province, whether that be in Drumheller or Dinosaur Park or Manyberries. This new specimen, however, comes from the southwestern part of the province. It actually comes from the foothills of the Rocky Mountains, and it's the first horned dinosaur found in that region. This is what the outcrop looks like. It's a beautiful area along the Old Man River. You can see the mountains in the background. It looks very different from the badlands that we find dinosaurs here in Drumheller and in Dinosaur Provincial Park. Now, although it is distinct geographically from where the other horned dinosaurs occur, temporally, in geological time, it overlaps with some of those areas near Drumheller. So what I've added is basically a chart showing the different formations, and those formations coincide with the colors on the map here, where those formations outcrop. And the thing that I want to point out is that with some of the help of Dr. Dennis Brayman, we've been able to date using pollen samples that this specimen comes from this period that's equivalent to the upper part of the Horseshoe Canyon Formation, which is in the Drumheller Valley. So our new specimen comes after the dinosaurs from Dinosaur Provincial Park. It comes after dinosaurs like Anchiceratops and Rhinoceratops from here in Drumheller, and it comes from before the period of time when Triceratops comes from, and it's roughly equivalent to Eotriceratops. And this is a very interesting period of time for the late Cretaceous, for what's happening in terms of the evolution of this group. So just to put that into perspective, if we go back to our understanding of Ceratopsian evolution, Hellboy comes from this period here, just after the Centrosaurians go extinct, but not at the point at which the Chasmosaurians go extinct. This is the outcrop at the site. Again, very different from what we see here in Drumheller. Very steep slopes, very close to the river. And the specimen was actually found by a geologist from Calgary named Peter Hughes. He recognized that it wasn't a fossil, it was probably something important. He reported it to the museum, and then the museum sent out a team to go investigate and to collect the fossil. There were a few issues with that, though. One is that you can see the slopes are quite steep, so it's very difficult to move around. Very close to the water, but this water is actually protected bull trout spawning habitat. The bull trout, for those of you who don't know, is our provincial fish, and it's protected. And we're actually not allowed to introduce any sediment from the dig into the river. You can imagine how working on such a narrow area, it's very difficult to do that, digging a big hole into the cliff, but not having the sediment enter the river. So a cofferdam was built to contain the sediment so it didn't get into the river. It's one of the many mitigation things we had to do with this project. The excavation of the actual specimen was also difficult because some of the rock that the specimen was very hard. Jackhammers were used to isolate the specimen from the surrounding rock. Here you see it partway exposed with a geological hammer for scale, and you can start to see a few of the shapes emerging of what will be the skull. Now, it's much too big to carry across the river, so the specimen was actually airlifted via helicopter and brought back to the museum. That's not the end of the story, though. That's just the beginning. Now we have a skull and a giant block of really hard rock. And that's where the technicians come in. Darren Tankey, the technician who worked on this skull, basically had to use a technique where he used an angle grinder to carve a waffle pattern in the rock and then used a chisel to bust out cubes of rock down to close to the surface of the bone. And then he let the small tools take over. Just because the rock was so difficult, you couldn't use traditional air scribe to get down to the surface of the bone. This is what the specimen looks like part of the way through preparation. You can start to see some of the details emerging. Here's the eye socket or the orbit here, and you see two little stubby horns, one there and one there above each eye. At this point, I want to address the nickname that was given to the specimen. The nickname was given before I arrived, but the nickname has multiple reasons why it was given. Of course, the nickname's Hellboy. The most obvious reason is that it looks like the comic book character Hellboy. It has these stubby horns over the eyes. But the other reasons is that the rock that it was in was incredibly hard, so that it was a hellish specimen to work on, given how difficult the rock was. And it also reflects back the collection, the difficulties we had dealing with the excavation of the specimen itself. This is what the frill looks like, partly prepared, and you can already see it has this very distinctive morphology showing distinct from other horned dinosaurs. And here's an image of that frill getting put back onto the skull, showing the steps in the preparation of this animal. And finally, here's a very proud Darren with the complete skull of Hellboy. And what I want to highlight here is the timeline involved. So often people think you find a new dinosaur and it's described right away and published right away, and that's often not the case. The specimen was found back in 2005. It was excavated in 2006 and 2008 by a crew from the museum. The preparation took place over about 18 months, from 2010 to 2011. And then the research took place in 2014, 2015. And that's when I got involved. So all of that beforehand did not involve me. And there's many people who invested a lot of time in this project. And although I'm the one standing here, we need to acknowledge everyone involved. And then finally, once it was published, we had an unveiling on June 4th. I'll get to this in a moment. But there was tons of people around at the museum who were involved in that as well. So everybody contributed to this project. And seeing the skull in 2 dimensions is one thing. You have to really see it in 3 dimensions to get an idea of how weird it actually looks. It has a whole bunch of very odd features. I already mentioned the stubby horns over the eyes. The nose is very upturned, very large horn on the nose, and the frill is the really impressive part with these huge scallops around the edge. There's these pentagonal plates almost around the side. This is a 3D laser scan of the skull just to show what it looks like in 3 dimensions. Now, the first project when we have anything that's a new specimen is the actual description of that specimen. And this includes 2 main parts. It includes the illustration. So we draw the bones in multiple views. We show all the structures. And at the same time, we also describe it in terms of text. And the reason for this is because not all the scientists can come and see the specimen for themselves. They have to look at the literature to be able to compare the animals. So some of the resulting drawings look like this. We point out some of the bones that are important, the contacts between these bones or the sutures, some of the important features, and then this can be used by other scientists to compare to their animals. Now, at this point, I want to point out that the skull as it looks right now is not the same as the skull shape that it would have been as alive. The skull has been crushed, it's been deformed by being in the rock for so long. So there are 3 particular things that I want to point out that are probably not reflective of the actual shape originally of the anatomy. The first is that the nose or the nasal horn has been kind of upturned, rotated up on top of the snout. The second is that the frill or the plane of the frill has been increased quite a bit. It should be much flatter. And you can actually see that in the midline in the center, the frill's actually been kinked. And the third is that the skull has almost certainly been foreshortened. So it's been crushed kind of front to back, and as a result, it's widened. This is an ongoing project by Dr. Don Henderson, who's working on kind of retro-deforming the skull, trying to figure out what the animal looked like in life. So if you have any questions about that, you can ask Don as well. And I like to make comparisons to that the skull looks similar to horned lizards that we have alive today. This is a genus called Phrenosoma. We have this genus, not this particular species, in Alberta, in southern Alberta. And the crest on the back of that skull, I think, looks very similar to the crest of our Hellboy specimen. These, of course, are not closely related at all. The similarity is purely just convergence in shape. But the thing I want to point out is a huge variance in size, huge disparity. The Phrenosoma, as a lizard, could easily fit multiple ones inside the fenestra of the frill of Hellboy. So it just gives you an idea of how big this animal actually is. Now, although it is crushed, it is still a very impressive, although it's crushed and it has some deformation, it's still a very impressive specimen. Particularly, I want to highlight the frill. This is that shield on the back of the skull. It has two main components. It has the parietal, which is here shown in purple in the middle, and then it has the scamosals, which are paired bones on either side, and together that makes up this kind of semicircular frill. And then around the periphery of that frill, you have all these what are called epiossifications. These are individual bones that fuse onto the skull later in life. You can see it has this one median one that's in the middle. That's kind of a weird shape. And the other ones are kind of triangular or pentagonal, and they get smaller from the back towards the front. And these are huge. These are the largest epiossifications of any chasmosaurian. So a very impressive skull. And if we turn to the horns, it has a series of horns as well. It has those stubby horns over the eyes. It has this relatively large horn over the nose. And then it has this horn coming off the cheek called the epijugal as well. So quite an ornamental skull. Now the first question we have to ask is, does this represent something new? Is this a new species? And to do that, we have to compare it to known species. And we look for things that are called autapomorphies. And basically what an autapomorphy is it's a distinct feature that you can point to that says that this is unique from all the other species, something that other animals don't have. And just for a couple of very obvious examples, things like the tail of a beaver or the bill of a platypus, the tusk of a narwhal or the crest of a cassowary, these are examples of autapomorphies. If you see that, you know that's diagnostic for that particular animal. And these are very obvious examples. Most autapomorphies are very subtle things that are hard to explain, but I chose these because they are very extreme. So if we look at the skull, are there unique, distinct things that it has that other animals don't have? And there are several, actually. First off, there's that median epiossification. There's that separate bone that's right in the midline there. And it has a few things that are weird about it. First off, it's kind of set off proud from the rest. They're not in the same plane. And it's triangular in cross-section, whereas all the other ones are kind of flattened. So that's very distinct. There's this ridge running down the middle of the frill, very sharp ridge. You don't see that in other horned dinosaurs as well. These epiossifications that are paired are large, they're flattened, and they're spade-shaped, or they're pentagonal. Again, other horned dinosaurs don't have these shapes of epiossifications. There's a ridge that runs behind the eye horn that you can see on both sides there. The fenestrae, these are these holes in the frill, they're actually quite small. Usually these things are quite large. And in this case, they're actually about the same size as the orbits or the eye sockets, which is a distinct feature for this animal as well. And finally, the horns over the eyes are much smaller than the horn over the nose, which is odd for this group of animals as well. So yes, it is distinct from other dinosaurs, and it's not just a little bit different from others, it's really different. And because of this, it's a new dinosaur, so we get to name it and describe it as something new. So we know it has a nickname, Hellboy. We had to give it a scientific name, both genus and species components of that name. So we gave it the name Regaliceratops peterhusi. And the regali comes from Latin for regalis, meaning royal. The ceratops comes from Greek, meaning horn face. And peterhusi, of course, honors Peter Hughes, the man who found it. So it roughly translates into Peter Hughes's royal horn face. And the royal is actually a bit of a double meaning. It refers to the crown, so that frill looks kind of like a crown with all these serrations on the back. But it also pays tribute to the Royal Tyrrell Museum. 2015, when the specimen was named, was our 30th anniversary. So it was a bit of a tribute to all the research on horned dinosaurs that the museum has done. And here's a picture of Peter Hughes with Regaliceratops peterhusi. Again, very proud of the discovery. And it gives you a sense of scale of that skull as well. So the next question we had is, we have the fossil skull, but what did the animal look like in life? And this is really important because we have to communicate what this animal looked like to the public, whether it be in a talk like I'm giving right now, or whether it be as part of a gallery, or whether it be in a press release, something like that. So to do this, we commissioned a life reconstruction from paleoartist Julius Cittoni. He did the stuff you saw at the beginning of the talk. He's an amazing paleoartist, and the museum has done a lot of work with him over the years. And what I'm going to show you in the next couple slides is kind of the evolving idea of what this animal looked like in life that kind of resulted from an interchange between the artist and the scientists and the designers as well. So here's the initial sketch of what the animal is, and I'm just going to show you how that morphs as we go back and forth about how this animal looks like through time. You can see we started to add some color here, putting it back in the environment, and that's changing as we go back and forth. And in the end, we add a whole bunch of color to the skull, particularly to the frill. And that gets back to this idea that these are probably largely for display structures, not necessarily for armament or weaponry. So this was our final kind of photorealistic illustration of what this animal may have looked like. And Julius also did a very pen and ink stylized one as well. These are great things that the museum can use when we're communicating to the public about this new discovery. The next part of the project was looking at how this animal is related to other horned dinosaurs. So we know it's distinct, but who is it closely related to? And to do this, we look for things called synapomorphy. So instead of an autapomorphy, which is unique to only one animal, it's basically a feature that is shared by a group of animals and clusters them together or unites them together. And just a really very obvious example of this is milk production and suckling in mammals. Mammals produce milk for their young. If an animal produces milk for the young, there's a very good chance it's going to be a mammal. It's a good, strong character that unites that group together. And again, this is a very extreme example. Most synapomorphies that we find are very subtle things that the experts can argue about, but this is just a very solid example. So do we have characters that this shares with other chasmosaurians? And the answer is yes. It has what's called a premaxillary septal fossa, so a little divot in the front of the nose here. It has this thing called a narial strut shown in red there. That is basically this bridge of bone running vertically through the middle of the nose. It has this triangular process. This is a process rising from the bottom of the nose and projecting into the nasal cavity. There's this caudoventral process. This is a process on the back of the premaxilla, a separate bone, and it's very constant in length. It's slender, whereas in the other group, the centrosaurians, it actually expands out. It's kind of spatula-shaped. This is a very strong character. The scamosal itself is triangular in shape. It's not rectangular that you would see in a centrosaurian. And the processes coming off of the scamosal, they don't imbricate. They're basically all in a line. They're all lined up. Whereas in centrosaurians, especially as adults, these all rotate and they imbricate upon each other. And finally, if we look at those epiossifications at the back of the frill, there's 3 or fewer from the parietal per side, whereas centrosaurians tend to have between 5 and 7 per side. So very different there. And we can look for more characters as well. There's a whole bunch of characters that it shares with another group called the Triceratopsini, which are the animals very closely related to Triceratops. The first of these is that it has this fenestra, or this hole in the front of the nose. Again, that process for the premaxilla, it's both unforked and it inserts between 2 other bones, the nasal and the maxilla. If we look at the back of the frill, it's rounded. It doesn't have a divot or an excavation in the back. The widest point of the frill is kind of in the middle. It doesn't widen towards the back that many other groups do. And the midline parietal bar is actually quite wide, although it is buckled as well. And all of these characters suggest that this thing is actually reasonably closely related to Triceratops. So what we do is we have a whole spreadsheet of hundreds of characters in multiple different species. We basically ask the computer to try many millions of trees and to spit out the shortest possible evolutionary scenario. And we've decided that the shortest scenario is probably the best answer until we get more information. When we do this, this is the answer that we get. I don't expect you to get much from this. I realize it's just names. I'm just going to point out some of the big features. First off, All the things in blue, those are your horned dinosaurs, those are the Ceratopsidae. Here's our Chasmosaurians in red. And then within Chasmosaurin, there's two groups that we get. We get a Chasmosaurus group shown in green, and then we get a Triceratops group shown in purple. And Regaliceratops falls within this Triceratops group. I know this isn't very easy to read, so I'm going to make this a bit easier. I'm going to rotate it, and I'm going to scale it to time, and I'm going to add some pictures. So here we have a vertical axis for time. Here we have images of what all these species actually look like. And the big thing that I want to point out here is that this Chasmosaurus group in green, the species of that group occur earlier in time, mainly in the Campanian, than the Triceratops group, shown in purple and orange here, and they occur mainly in the Maastrichtian. So we have kind of two different groups in time. And Regaliceratops occurs in that second group, in the Triceratops group. And you can see what its close relatives look like. They're things like Triceratops, Anchiceratops, Eotriceratops. And it's kind of like, it doesn't really fit. It's like that game, which one of these things is not like the other? Everything else has big horns over the eyes, small horn over the nose. Regaliceratops has the opposite. It doesn't fit with what it's almost certainly closely related to. This is a bit odd. I can show this a different way. Instead of showing the entire skulls, we're just going to look at the size of the horn over the eyes. So it's the same data, it's just now we're just looking at the size of that horn. And you can see we have kind of two different options. We have a short horn morph, which is shown in red, and then we have a long horn morph, which is shown in black. You can see earlier in the time with that Chasmosaurus group, there's a lot of variation. There's long horns, there's short horns, there's all sorts of stuff going on. But by the time we get into the Maastrichtian, by the time we get later in time, they basically settled on a longhorn morph, and everything has this big longhorn over the eye, except for Regaliceratops. It's the exception to the rule in this case. It's not just the postorbital horn that's weird, or the eye horn that's weird. There's a whole bunch of characters that are kind of odd. We call this a suite of unexpected display structures. I've already mentioned the postorbital horn. The nasal horn, shown in green here, is much larger than we'd expect, given the size of the skull. Those epiossifications are huge. Big epiossifications is something we see in centrosaurians, not chasmosaurians. And then the frill itself is short as well. These are all characters that are very similar to centrosaurians. So to show this in a different way, this is just a biplot. So I'm going to plot up the size of the nasal horn on the horizontal axis, so getting bigger towards the towards the right, and the size of the eye horn or the postorbital horn vertically. And because it's a log-log plot, if you know your math, then any line with a slope of 1 is a ratio of how big the nasal horn is to the postorbital horn. I'm just going to throw up the different species and see where they fall. So here are our centrosaurians. This is the group that has the big nasal horn. And unsurprisingly, they fall on kind of the bottom right part of the chart. We can throw up the Pachyrhinosaurs. They fall within that same group as well. Makes sense. These are the Campanian Chasmosaurians, so that earlier in time group. And as I said, they're kind of all over the place. There's a lot of variation in terms of their relative horn size. But by the time we get to the Maastrichtian, the Chasmosaurians have kind of fallen to this very restricted area. They all have big postorbital horns, big eye horns, relatively small nasal horns. And that's the group that Regaliceratops belongs to. But if we actually throw Regaliceratops into this plot, it doesn't fall out with them. It doesn't even fall out with the Chasmosaurians from the Campanian. It falls out with the entire group, the other group entirely, the Centrosaurians, and it falls out with the Centrosaurians from the Maastrichtian, from the Campanian. So not only does it fall out with the wrong group, it falls out from the group at the wrong time as well. So it's a very odd, very unexpected discovery in terms of the relative size of those horns and those frill features. So if we go back to kind of our setup of the scenario in terms of the evolution of this group, we have these two diverging lineages, the Centrosaurians, the Chasmosaurians. The Centrosaurians go extinct. What we're suggesting, based on this new animal, is that at least one lineage of Chasmosaurians kind of independently or convergently evolved a Centrosaurian-like display structure in terms of the relative size of the horns and in terms of the emphasis on the epiossifications as well. We know that it's a Chasmosaurian. It's a very derived Chasmosaurian, but it's kind of looked like a Centrosaurian. And the idea behind this is that once the Centrosaurians go extinct, that's a whole area of morphospace, of shape space that's unoccupied, that Chasmosaurians can then move into. just to show this kind of in a different way, here's some schematic diagrams of 3 different animals. Triceratops on the left, Regaliceratops in the middle, Styracosaurus on the right, and Styracosaurus is a centrosaurian. Triceratops and Regaliceratops are chasmosaurians. Triceratops and Regaliceratops are both more similar than either is to Regaliceratops in terms of relatedness. So any similarities between Regaliceratops and Styracosaurus are the result of independent evolution within those 2 groups. So we have this idea about how this impacts our understanding of the evolutionary scenario of horned dinosaurs. Now we have to look somewhere to publish this. So in this case, the scientific publication includes the description of the specimen. It includes the naming and the diagnosis of the new species. It includes our results, which the phylogenetic analysis, so that's that investigation into the relationships of the horned dinosaurs. And then this idea about convergent evolution and the implications for horned dinosaur evolution. The journal that we ended up going with was Current Biology. This is a general biology journal. It's not one specific for paleontology, but it has things on genetics or embryology or ecology, as well as paleontology. We submitted the paper on March 14th. It was actually reviewed quite quickly. We got revisions back on March 30th. So this was sent out to other independent scientists. They read the paper, they offered some criticisms, some improvements, and then we had a chance to revise that, and we did, and it was accepted on April 20th. So very fast review process. This is much faster than it normally takes. The paper actually came out in 2 forms. It came out online on June 4th, and then it came out in print on June 15th. And we were fortunate in that Julius's amazing reconstruction of the animal actually was chosen as the cover art for that issue when it came out in paper. For the June 4th digital release, this fortuitously occurred at the same time that a new gallery, or approximately the same time a new gallery was being developed and opened at the Royal Tyrrell Museum. And that gallery is the Fossils in Focus gallery. The idea behind this is that it features either newly discovered or newly prepared fossils that have never been on display before. And Hellboy was going to be put kind of at the entrance to this new gallery. So the gallery was actually opened a couple of weeks before the paper came out. But on the same day the paper came out, the museum had a press release that both unveiled the new gallery and unveiled the new dinosaur at the same time. And we invited media from various parts of Alberta to come, and many of you were involved in this. It was actually very exciting, very nerve-wracking, but it was a really cool event to be involved with. And we got a lot of media attention internationally. I've just thrown up a couple of headlines that went all over the world. Myself and Don Henderson, the co-author on the paper, were busy for several days before and after fielding interviews. We must have done dozens of interviews. So very good press release in that regard. One of the best ways to evaluate this is actually looking after the fact. And there's actually several kind of year in review type things that come out about science. One of these is Discover magazine. They have their top 100 science stories of the year. And for 2015, Regaliceratops was selected as spot number 38, and that was shared with Wendyceratops, another new horned dinosaur that was announced by our colleagues from the Royal Ontario Museum and the Cleveland Museum of Natural History. So that was a really cool honor to get. Even more exciting was altmetric. This is a way of measuring how many people are talking about this article based on how often it's tweeted or how often it's on Facebook, how many blog posts, news articles online. And they also released their top 100 list for 2015. And we were ranked in 20th spot for all scientific papers in 2015. So I think that was a huge vote of confidence for the paper and how exciting the discovery was as well. But by far the coolest way of looking back and seeing how this was received by the public was looking at what I call fan art. Whenever a new fossil organism is described, there's always people who draw their own interpretations on what this animal looked like, offering their own artistic skill. Here's just a small sample of what's on the internet that features Regaliceratops or Hellboy. These are different people interpreting this dinosaur in different ways. That's just the first page. Here's another page that just shows all of these people getting excited about our specimen that we have at the museum, and we're the only ones in the world to have it, and we were involved in the research. That was very cool. Some of these are amazing. These are reconstructions of kind of semi-realistic of what this animal may have looked like. A lot are less realistic, more cartoony. Some people really love the idea of Hellboy riding Hellboy. That was a common theme. So really cool to see this kind of getting into pop culture. And there's even Regaliceratops origami. So by far the coolest part of my job is when something like this happens, when you can take a fossil that was obscure a couple years ago, work with the team to prepare it, to do the science on it, to put it on display, and to see how it is received internationally. And now Regaliceratops is part of pop culture, and the museum was the ones responsible for putting that forward. So I was really excited to be part of this, and there are many people at the museum who also should be proud of their contributions to this discovery. Just to sum up kind of what's next now that Regaliceratops is done, well, we have more specimens to describe. There's other specimens from the area. We need to prep these. We need to describe them. Some of them might be new species as well. We'll see. There is a project ongoing that I'm doing investigating the variation in that frill and looking at the potential function of that frill, whether this idea of display makes a lot of sense given how variable they are. And I'm also evaluating the idea of the homology of those frill processes, those epiossifications, and how that affects our understanding of the evolution of this group. And then also, Don Henderson is still working on the retrodeformation of the skull, seeing what this animal looked like in life, and I'm sure he'll have some results soon about what this animal looked like. No pressure there, Don. And with that, I have a ton of people to thank, involved in all the way from the discovery, through the preparation, through the media release, through the fabrication and collections, people who were involved with this particular project. And I'd also like to thank you for your time and for your attention. So, thanks.